The Red Death had long been destroying the country. No disease had ever been so deadly or so terrible. Blood was the form it chose. Its mark was the redness and the horror of blood. Its victims suffered sharp pains and sudden dizziness. There was a heavy bleeding at the pores, and then death. This resulted in bright red stains upon the body and especially on the face. It caused the victim to be shut away from help and sympathy of others. The disease took only about a half an hour to strike and kill. But Prince Prospero was happy, daring, and wise. When half of his people had died, he sent for 1,000 healthy and light-hearted friends. He chose these people from among the knights and ladies of his court. Then he and his friends retired behind the walls of one of his castles. The building was large and magnificent. A strong, high wall surrounded it. The wall had gates of iron, and servants brought furnaces and hammers and welded shut the bolts of the gate. There was to be no entrance or exit from the castle for whatever reason. The outside world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was foolish to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the means of pleasure. There were clowns, ballet dancers, and musicians. There was plenty of food, and there was wine. All of this and security remained inside. Outside was the Red Death. The prince and his 1,000 friends stayed in seclusion for the next 6 months. All the while the disease spread throughout the land. Then the prince decided to hold a masked ball of the most unusual kind. It was a great and wonderful affair, but first, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, a royal suite. In many palaces, such suites form a long and straight line. The folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either side. This way, the view of the whole suite is hardly blocked. Here, the case was very different, as might have been expected from the prince's love of the bizarre. The suite was set up so oddly that one could barely see more than one room at a time. There was a sharp turn every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn there was a different effect. To the left and right and middle of each wall was a tall and narrow window. This window looked out upon a closed hallway that followed the turns of the suite. These windows were made of stained glass. The color of the glass matched the decorations of the room to which the windows opened. For example, the room at the eastern end had blue decorations, and its windows were a deep blue. The second room had purple ornaments and tapestries, and the panes were purple. The third room was green throughout, and so were the windows. The fourth room was furnished and lighted with orange. The fifth was white, and the sixth was violet. The seventh room was closely covered in black velvet tapestries. They hung all over the ceilings and down the walls. They fell in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and color. But in this room only, the color of the windows failed to match the decorations. The panes were scarlet, a deep blood-red color. In not one of the 7 rooms was there any lamp or candelabrum. In fact, there was no light of any kind coming from within the suite, but in the hallways opposite each window stood a table. On this table was a metal container and a flame that reflected off the tinted glass and lit up the room. The light produced many fantastic sights, but the effect in the black room was different. The firelight that streamed in upon the dark curtains and the blood-tinted panes was horrible. It produced a wild look on the faces of those who entered, and there were few in the company bold enough to set foot inside the room at all. In this room there was also a huge ebony clock. Its pendulum swung back and forth with a dull, heavy clang. And each hour there came from the clock a clear, loud, deep sound. The sound was so unusual that each hour the orchestra was forced to pause and listen to it. The waltzers, too, stopped their dancing, and the entire happy crowd was upset for a moment. However, when the sound stopped, a light laughter once again filled the room. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own foolishness, and they made the whispering vows to each other that the next time the clock chimed, they would not stop playing. Yet, when another hour passed and the clock chimed, the same uneasiness was felt by all. In spite of these things, it was a merry and magnificent affair. The tastes of the prince were strange. He had a fine eye for color and effect. He ignored the normal rules of fashion. His plans were bold and fiery. There were some who would have thought him mad, yet his followers felt he was not. He had chosen, in large part, the colors and decorations of the 7 rooms for this great party, and it was his own taste that had set the tone for the masqueraders. To be sure, the costumes were strange or ugly. There was much glare and glitter, and much that was unusual. There were strange figures with unusual legs and arms. There were wild designs. There was much of the beauty and much of the bizarre. There was something of the terrible and something of that which might cause disgust. Back and forth in the 7 rooms stalked many masqueraders, appearing as if they were dreams. These dreams twisted in and about, taking color from the rooms, and they caused a wild magic in the orchestra that seemed like the echo of their steps. Then the ebony clock struck. For a moment all was still and silent, except the voice of the clock. The dreams seemed frozen as they stood, but the echoes of the sound died away. They had lasted for only an instant, and a light, quiet laughter floated after them. Then the music swelled, and the dreams came to life again, twisting and turning more merrily than ever. But to the most westward room, the Black Room, none of the maskers had gone. For there, through the blood-colored panes, flowed a deep, mysterious light, and the blackness of the drapes added to the terrifying effect. The other rooms were very crowded, and in them beat the heart of life. The party went gaily on until finally the clock struck midnight. Then the music stopped, as I have told. The dancing of the waltzers had halted, and there was an uneasy quietness as before. Now there were 12 strokes of the clock to be sounded. Perhaps with more time, more thought crept into the minds of the crowd, and perhaps, too, for the final chime had sounded, many in the crowd had become aware of a certain masked figure. This figure had not drawn the attention of anyone before. Now the rumor of his presence was spreading, and there arose a murmur of disapproval and surprise. These feelings turned finally to ones of terror and disgust. It may be thought that among this strange crowd no such costume could have caused such a feeling. In truth, the nature of the costumes that night knew no limits, but the figure in question had gone even beyond the prince's tastes. The whole company seemed to feel that the costume and manner of the stranger was neither amusing nor proper. The figure was tall and thin and was covered from head to foot in clothing of the grave. The mask that covered the face was made to resemble the face of a stiffened corpse, and all of this might have been accepted by the masqueraders, but this figure had gone so far as to assume the look of the Red Death. His clothing was dabbed in blood, and his entire face was sprinkled with the Red Horror. When Prince Prospero's eyes first set upon this image, he began to shake violently. Then, in the next moment, his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded of the servants who stood near him, "who dares insult us this way? Seize him and unmask him. That way we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise." Prince Prospero was in the eastern or blue room when he spoke these words, but they rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly. For the prince was a bold and healthy man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. At first, the prince's servants made a slight rushing movement toward the figure, who was coming closer to the speaker, but the figure had inspired great fear among the crowd, so no one put out a hand to stop him. Without trouble, he passed within a yard of the prince. Then the huge crowd shrank back from the centers of the room towards the walls, and the figure made his way without interruption. Through the rooms he walked with steady steps, from the blue room to the purple. Then he moved from the purple to the green, through the green to the orange. He made his way through the orange to the white, and from there to the violet. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero rushed through the 6 rooms. He was mad with rage and filled with shame at his own lack of courage. But no one followed him, because a deadly terror had seized all. The prince held above him a drawn dagger. He approached to within 3 or 4 feet of the figure. Then, the figure, having reached the entrance of the Black Room, turned suddenly to face him. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped shining upon the sable carpet. An instant later, Prince Prospero fell face downward, in death. Then, gathering the wild courage, a group of masqueraders ran into the Black Room, where they seized the figure, who stood tall and straight within the shadow of the clock. There was a gasp of horror, for the clothing and corpse-like mask, which they had so violently grabbed, was empty of any physical form. Now the presence of the Red Death was recognized. He had come in like a thief in the night. One by one, the partygoers dropped in the blood-stained halls of their party. The life of the ebony clock went out with the last of the masqueraders, and the flames outside the colored windows went out as well. Darkness and decay and the Red Death ruled over all.